Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Savvy Dragon podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Beygelman, and today's episode we have a guest, Noah Beygelman.
Hello.
And today's episode is going to be all about how Flesh and Blood is different from other TCG games. And Noah plays Flesh and Blood, and he's played other TCG games before too. So we're just going to dive in and talk about it. So you've started off playing Yu-Gi-Oh as your first TCG game. What led you to stop playing Yu-Gi-Oh and start playing other TCG games, and what was the cause and reason for that?
So I think Yu-Gi-Oh, while it's super fun to play like in a vacuum, I think the organized play system has leaves a lot to be desired, I guess, to say it nicely. The prizing, the way that the time rules incentivize playing cards to exploit that, and in general, just it seems like Konami doesn't value organized play as much as LSS, the company behind F.A.B, does. So I kind of stuck with Yu-Gi-Oh for a while just because the gameplay seemed so much better than the other games. But once I found F.A.B and the gameplay was better than Yu-Gi-Oh and the organized play was better, I decided that was time for me to switch.
So you started playing F.A.B 1 year ago, 2 years ago?
So I played in my first locals for F.A.B actually way back in the end of 2021. F.A.B has a cool online client that actually lets you keep a rolling record of every single event you've ever played in. Like, it's saved in your profile. So I can go back and see my results from local armories way back when I was struggling to get some wins. But I was still balancing F.A.B and Yu-Gi-Oh. And then I would say in early 2022 is when I really started playing F.A.B as like my primary full-time game.
And you've had some good dubs in F.A.B. You've won some higher prizing than probably you ever did in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah.
The full time that you've played. Is that like another incentive, or is it just like a perk?
So I think the monetary prizing, to me, it's less about the fact that I can win money that's like life-changing, because I think you still have to get insanely lucky to actually like win a Pro Tour or win Worlds. These are like the equivalents to the Yu-Gi-Oh Nats and Yu-Gi-Oh Worlds. You still have to get crazy lucky to get first and get the really good prizing. But I think the prizing as an incentive for someone to commit money to travel to events is really huge, in that you can essentially allow the game to pay for itself. Like, I can basically play F.A.B at the pace I'm going now. I've like been net positive on money I've spent. I own basically like all the cards. I travel to all the major events, and because of the prize distribution, I'm able to essentially subsidize my playing with the cash I win.
Yeah, that's super good. And you just joined a team too. And do you think that like the players, how they like interact with each other, it's like a positive environment? Like, I know Yu-Gi-Oh is positive too, but did you
Yeah, so I think one of the key differences is the demographic for F.A.B is a bit older. I would say people are like late 20s, early 30s. A lot of them have like full-time jobs. Some of them have been TCG veterans. They've kind of jumped from game to game and settled on F.A.B now. So that demographic is a bit different from Yu-Gi-Oh, where most of the people who play Yu-Gi-Oh tend to be either younger or focus on Yu-Gi-Oh as like their primary and only game, whereas F.A.B has some overlap there.
Yeah, and we also started playing Lorcana, both of us, recently, and that a lot of people have been saying that it's kind of like the kids' TCG game, but I would say like it's not necessarily true. I mean, it's definitely friendly to that demographic as well, but you get some older people playing Lorcana as well, like Disney fans. So as far as playing Lorcana, do you see that as like a lesser one, or do you see it as like equal to something like F.A.B, which is like older people? How do you kind of rank that in the TCG?
Yeah, so I think Lorcana, the mechanics are very simple, but that doesn't mean that the strategy isn't enticing to someone who enjoys strategy. So while it's can be boiled down to, okay, I play a card as ink, I play a 1-drop, I pass. My opponent plays a card as ink, they play a 1-drop and pass. To someone playing F.A.B and Yu-Gi-Oh, it seems like, oh wow, this game is so slow, like it takes forever to get anything going. All the characters are relatively basic, right? There's like some competitive characters that are literally just what we call in Yu-Gi-Oh! Vanillas, right? They have no text. It's just, okay, it has 1 attack, 3 willpower, quest for 1. It's a fine card to play. So I think that's one kind of shift in what makes Lorcana seem more attractive to people who haven't played any TCGs before. But I think at the high level where just this past weekend was actually the Atlanta and Lille Disney Lorcana challenges. And if you go back and watch some of those streams at like especially in the top cut, you can see that there's like super dynamic board states where both players are manipulating like 5-6 characters on the board, and it gets pretty complex. So yeah, I think it's essentially a great way to get started, but also something that you can stick with and feel like you're really, expanding your knowledge of how to play card games.
Yeah, the intimidation factor is definitely like much lower as like a beginner TCG player. So what is making you kind of stick with Flesh and Blood as your main game instead of like leaning more towards one or the other? Yeah,
so my favorite part about F.A.B's like philosophy for how they do organized play is at the major events, they actually do a split format. And at some of the smaller events, they alternate between limited, which is essentially sealed, like you open packs, you play with the cards, or draft, where you're in a pod of 8, you open packs, pick a card, pass it around. If you've played Cube and Yu-Gi-Oh, you're familiar with how the draft process works. So in the large F.A.B events, they do a split format of half the rounds approximately are constructed, where you bring your own deck to the tournament, and then the other approximately half are draft. So it's really like a good test of skill to say, okay, are you able to adapt on the fly to what's happening in the draft, as well as are you able to predict a metagame and bring a constructed deck? So I think that like split and testing both aspects of your skill and the pinnacle of the games is like really interesting.
Yeah, do you prefer like the draft or the constructed part? I know you like deck building, like even in Yu-Gi-Oh, you're really into deck building. So
yeah,
the draft part is probably like a nice challenge, but do you still prefer the constructed, or do you like doing draft better in those types of tournaments?
So I never thought I would say this when I first started. When I first started playing F.A.B, I thought, oh, okay, I have, decent deck building skills in Yu-Gi-Oh. Surely this will translate over and I'll be like loving constructed. And one other aspect I should mention quickly about F.A.B is when you do constructed, you can plan for matchups such that before the match starts, you and your opponent both tell each other what hero you're playing. I know this sounds crazy if you're someone who plays like Lorcana or Yu-Gi-Oh, to be like, before you start the match, tell your opponent, okay, I'm playing this deck. It's like, it would be so out of place in either one of those tournaments to give your opponent that info, but that's how F.A.B works. So I thought that aspect of the constructed gameplay would be something I could tackle well, but I've actually found that limited in draft specifically is what I've had more fun playing in F.A.B because of the fact that in F.A.B you see the majority of your deck in most games. So when you're drafting a limited deck, it's very likely that you'll be able to go through every single card in your deck, as well as every card in your opponent's deck. So if you're able to remember in the draft process all the cards that passed by you, you'll have actually a decent idea of what cards are contained in your opponent's deck as well as your own. So that aspect of like being able to track what your opponent's doing in the limited format, where the deck size is much smaller, the game goes quicker, I think has been like a really interesting departure from my previous experience.
Yeah. And how often is there like big changes to like the format and like new cards and stuff in F.A.B? Like, is it much slower than other games, and like do you prefer that, or is it faster?
Yeah, so it's much slower. They do just 4 sets per year as opposed to Yu-Gi-Oh, who does like 12 or more. It seems like there's basically new product every month, which I think is actually not my favorite part about F.A.B. I can't, it's not all rainbows and sunshine.
Yeah.
I would prefer there to be like more products launched, because one of the best parts about preparing for a YCS for me is like, okay, there's like the set drops on the Friday. We have to basically go, you scramble to pick up the cards at pre-releases. You have to try to figure out, okay, what are people going to be playing? Do I go like level 1 of okay, here's what I think is the best, or level 2 of here's what I think will beat what people think is the best.
Yeah.
So that kind of scramble is cool. Whereas with F.A.B just being a very rigid 4 sets per year, and now they've started doing a couple structure decks as well in the mix. But in general, it's way slower on product releases. So I wish there was more, but I think I'm in the minority there.
Yeah, definitely. So you're on a team called Fabled Runaways. What is that dynamic like, working with them, traveling with them? You guys carpool to things? Like, how is it?
Yeah, so one of the big differences, I think, in being with the Fabled Runaways as opposed to working with teams that I've either been on in the past or in other card games in general, is we have like a rigid schedule for stuff. Like we have every Wednesday we have a team meeting, and in that team meeting we have people who share like presentations about, okay, here's what I worked on this week, here's what I found. People like record their games and commentate over them and say like, okay, here's the lines of play that I took when playing this hero, here's why I think we should spend time as a team investigating this strategy, here's what I think would be a total waste of time, like we have 2 weeks before the event, nobody work on this because it's like not going to be a productive use of your time. So I think having like structure to say certain people on the team work on certain things because we all have the goal of creating the best deck for a tournament, and ideally having one of us be the victor of the tournament, with the rest of the top 8 being filled out by other runaways if possible. So yeah, being aligned on the same goal and working together to accomplish that has been like a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's great. And like the accountability part is like, I think, pretty important for that. I talked to Ruben a couple weeks ago about how Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of like a job for him, and that like kind of relates to like the whole team meeting and working towards like a similar goal. Do people on your team have other jobs, or do you know some people who like do it full time and just like work to pay their way through that way?
So there are some people in F.A.B who I think have kind of, this is like the less than a handful of people who actually are doing this full time, I think, just because of the fact there's not quite enough events yet to where you could reasonably make a living off of the game. But we all kind of have an agreement that we spend X number of hours, 2 hours, 4 hours, some amount of time per day, or maybe on a weekly basis. If people are working a lot during the week, they'll just spend like an entire weekend doing like 8 drafts in a weekend, just like turbo testing to get results because they can't do it during the week. But yeah, we all essentially put aside some amount of time every day to just keep your skills fresh and be playing the game.
Yeah. And you're going to Montreal this coming weekend. What are your expectations for the event? What are your team goals?
Yeah.
If you have any.
Yeah, so this weekend should be fun. It's what I mentioned earlier about there's some F.A.B events that are just limited. So this is one of them. The newest set, Part the Misveil, just dropped. Technically, this weekend is the street legal date where we'll be able to open 8 packs, build a deck, and play a tournament based on what we pull, which is always kind of nerve-wracking because I'm driving 6 hours with a bunch of large folks in a small car just to open some packs and hope I get good cards, right? At face value, it seems pretty daunting, but it's always been a lot of fun to try to solve the puzzle of, based on what I opened, what's my optimal strategy and how do I play to my win condition.
Yeah. And like, how is your team balanced? Are there people there that have been playing like since the game started? Like, are you guys fairly level on playing?
Yeah, so I think we have kind of a wide range. One other aspect of the team that I forgot to mention earlier that I think applies here is F.A.B really rewards people who are specialists. So we have some people on the team who are like, okay, no matter what, if this hero is really good in a certain format or is not as good, they will always try to make a build of that deck that's really, really competitive for a format. So we'll have people who are like illusionist specialists. For people who don't play F.A.B, it's just think of it like certain archetypes, like a red-blue specialist in Lorcana, or a Flunderies specialist in Yugioh, right? Someone who just always plays their deck rain or shine. We have these kind of people who fill certain roles, and then we also have the people who are like the grinders who are willing to just like try out anything and swap decks 2 days before the tournament to try to optimize their chances at winning. So F.A.B is still a relatively new game. There's not many people who have been playing for significantly longer than others since, the game hasn't been out that long.
Yeah, and that's like probably a good time to like start getting into it. A large differentiator between F.A.B and other TCG games is that it's best of one. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about the pressure involved in that, or maybe lack thereof if there's less stakes because it's best of one, or just your experience with transitioning from maybe best of three to best of one.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, one thing I mentioned earlier was that you reveal your hero to your opponent before the match starts. And there's actually some more stuff you do before the match starts to compensate for it being best of one. The second thing you do is you roll to decide who goes first. And I know this may be heresy to people playing Yugioh and Lorcana, but a lot of the times it's actually better to choose second. It's crazy. Wow. A balanced game where, it's not like the person who goes first has a great, much greater chance to win. And then the second thing you do is you sideboard before the match starts. So you basically sit down, you say, hello, I'm playing Icelander. What are you playing? They tell you their hero. You roll. The person who wins the roll chooses who gets to go first. And then you sideboard. And so this kind of eliminates the need for a best of three, where maybe in the first game, the way that you constructed your deck is to be like okay into most of the meta decks. But if you play against an off meta deck, you'll have maybe a quarter of your deck is just unusable. So if you draw those cards in game one and you lost the die roll and you're going second, these are basically unusable cards and you're really disadvantaged game one. Whereas F.A.B kind of breaks this paradigm where you only play one game. And if you build your deck in such a way to be able to remove cards that will be bad in a matchup and add in maybe some specific tech cards for a matchup, you'll essentially never have to play with dead cards in your deck. So while best of one might sound scary, that, if you draw a bad hand or you make a mistake, then you just automatically lose and you have no hope of a game two or game three. But I think that the way that it ends up playing out is usually you're going to draw bad hands. Your opponent's also going to draw bad hands. You're going to make mistakes and your opponent will also make mistakes. And it's all about, staying alive, staying composed and being able to come back within that game, as opposed to just being like, okay, I messed up, scoop, go to game two. You still fight on for the chance to win that game.
Yeah, a lot of the mechanics of playing F.A.B too seem very friendly and even playing field. Yep. And being almost like a teammate with your opponent sometimes, telling them what you're playing. Mm-hmm. Where does the competitive edge come in with that? Yep. What makes you oh, I have to win, if it's so you want to be a good person with your teammate? Yeah. Does it still get hyper competitive or not really? Is it just for fun?
So I actually think it becomes more competitive because you remove the aspects of trying to pull one over on your opponent. Where you're oh, they weren't ready for this Nibiru, so I got them with the Nibiru, and then now the game's over. F.A.B has more aspects of getting incremental advantages, where you're okay, we're playing a game right now, and I'm, instead of Yu-Gi-Oh, where you use your life total as a resource, as long as you have at least one life point, and your opponent could have 15,000, but you have this, super wide board, you're able to just end the game in one turn. It essentially didn't matter. F.A.B, you're making trades where your life total is an accurate reflection of how the game is progressing. So if you're winning 40 life to their 25 life, because most heroes start the game at 40, then you're actually winning the game. And the competitive side is just about eking out those small advantages. Okay, on this turn cycle of my turn and their turn, I got plus 3 points of value, right? They use their cards to combine for 12 points of value, and I use mine to combine for 15. So it's not about ooh, I had this crazy combo where I just totally destroyed them. There is some aspect of that in F.A.B, right? It's a card game. You can have these crazy moments where you just OTK your opponent. It's not that's impossible. But the majority of games play out in such a way where you're just eking out incremental advantages and outplaying your opponent, or winning with superior cards in your deck over the turn cycles, as opposed to just okay, I have my combo, they have no way to stop me, and now I just win the game.
Yeah. Do they tend to be very long games since it's only one, or a lot of turns? Yeah,
so it depends on the decks, of course, right? There are different strategies. Some decks try to end the game quickly. whereas others try to make it go longer. But there are actually, competitively viable strategies in F.A.B that aim to go to what we call fatigue. Again, this is like a pretty foreign concept in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Lorcana, there are dedicated mill decks where you try to, deck your opponent out of cards. But in F.A.B, this is like a legitimate win condition by meta strategies in every format, where the way you intend to win the game is by being as defensive as possible and being, efficient with your attacks, such that your opponent eventually just runs out of ways to actually win the game, and you still have cards in your deck compared to them, so you're able to win. So, there's some games that can literally go the whole 50-minute turn timer just for one game.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, that's a lot of information to process. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today, Noah. Learned a lot. Let me know in the comments if you have played F.A.B before, played Lorcana, played Yu-Gi-Oh, or multiple games, and what your experiences are playing them. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
All right.
I think it was good.
Yeah. Be easy for me to edit.
Nice.